Hi, everybody. As Vic said, my name is Sarah. I am one of the PHP 8.0 release managers. I have done some release management in the past on 7.2, which is just about out of support, and on 7.1. But I've been with the PHP project for about 18 years. Put too much of my life into this project, but I like PHP, and PHP has liked me back. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in 8. The first bit of good news is that we are GAing 8.0 on November 26th. That date hasn't moved at all, although the names of the releases have changed a bit. On screen here, you also see Gabriel Caruso. He's my co-release manager on 8.0. We do a paired system where we have one veteran and one junior person doing each release. So as Yoda says, there are always two, a master and an apprentice. We will be ABI freezing tomorrow. I actually just found that out about 90 minutes ago. We had planned it for the October 13th, but we've been able to do a few things ahead of schedule. ABI freeze basically means nothing else substantive is going to change. Usually that comes at a much earlier point, but because this is a 0.0 release, we're into a new major, there's a lot more stuff getting stuffed in because this is our opportunity to break backwards compatibility in a few places and to do some riskier things like introducing a just-in-time. Like every other release, this is going to have 2 years worth of regular bug fixes and 1 additional year of security release fixes. So that's going to go out to November of 2022 and 2023. You can, at any point, see what are the current versions on phpnet/supported versions PHP. And the most important thing I want to say to everybody is please, 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 please test these things before we release them. We would rather release it with fewer bugs than with more bugs. I know that's a crazy thought. If you need some help on how to build and test and report bugs effectively, qa.php.net has a bunch of write-ups, but bugs.phpnet is where those need to be reported. So I picked my 8 favorite features of PHP 8 to talk about here. And there are a great deal more of them. You can see what's going into or went into any given release at any time by going to wiki.php.net/RFC. And if you look at the menu that appears on the right-hand side, that'll allow you to filter by version and see exactly what's gone in and what's still being discussed and what's been tossed out. First one is the one everybody's talking about for PHP 8, and that is the JIT, or just-in-time compiler. This takes all of your script code, turns them into machine code that can run directly on the CPU, which, in theory at least, should always be faster because we've removed that middleman of the PHP interpreter that takes your script and says, what you really mean is that, and tells the compiler, the processor, what to do. Few caveats about that. Number one, it's part of opcache. So if you don't have opcache enabled, you're not going to get the JIT. And you're probably not going to have opcache enabled on CLI because that's silly. There's no point caching any opcodes. And honestly, there's no point JITting if you're on CLI. So don't expect CLI performance to change at all because of the JIT. And secondly, we're only running on Intel platforms right now, so x86 and x86-64, and we don't do Windows. Both of those things may change in the coming weeks, months, versions, but right now that's the case, and it's a coin toss as to whether we'll go ARM support or Windows support next. I'm guessing ARM support more likely because MacBooks are going to start coming out with ARM processors, and solving Windows problems is frankly just a lot more difficult because the way the CPU deals with the instructions is actually a little bit different on Windows because Windows has been that kind of a force. It is enabled by default, so if you are running on in server mode, you've got opcache running already, you just get this for free. It's going to make your stuff some percentage faster. Not the 2 to 3 times that we saw from 5 to 7, but some percentage of CPU-bound workloads are going to get a little bit better. It's in tracing mode, which means that hot functions that are processed a whole bunch of times over the course of the web server's life, are going to get JITted sooner and better. But there is also another mode called functional, which means that every part of a script is going to be JITted as soon as it's loaded. But if it doesn't have a chance to see the code running in the interpreter first, it's not going to do as good of a job. So this is actually the best mode, is tracing. Next big feature is attributes. A lot of you are probably using annotations already in your PHP code. This allows you to put like @something into the doc block to tell some other part of the code that there's something special about your function. Maybe it tells the ORM that it gives or takes a certain piece of data, or it tells a request router that you handle a certain URI. What we've done is we've taken that and made it into a codified part of the syntax. And so in these examples where you see pound, open and close square brackets, these are attributes, which are sort of our versions of annotations. And they do effectively the same thing, but they also take parameters, and you can restrict where these things apply. They can put on free functions, classes, methods, properties, and arguments. Not going to dig too deep onto how to use them. That's sort of going to be determined by what the community decides is most important in frameworks and libraries. Named arguments, if you've ever used Python before, and personally I love Python as a shell scripting language, it's pretty good for that. Don't tell the Python people though, obviously I hate Python. Named arguments are exactly what they sound like. In this example, you can see we can not only change the order that these arguments go to functions, but we can skip optional arguments if we don't want to change what the defaulted value is. And we can also provide extra reading context to otherwise fairly opaque arguments. If you just pass a Boolean, like a true or false, to an argument to a function, it's hard to know what that means without going to the function definition. But if you can name the parameter that that Boolean is attached to, that instantly gives a reader of your code later on a lot more context for what that means. Union types was one of the first big features to hit 8.0. This came right on the heels of 7.4's expansions of the type system, and 7 has been expanding the type system since day one. We already have union types in a sense in the form of nullable types. So question mark type means this type or null. What we've done is we've expanded that out to all possible types. So you can say my function here, my method, specifically has an API that can deal with maybe this object type and that object type or a Boolean and nothing else. It allows you to both define and constrain your APIs to exactly what you care about and not have to worry about those edge cases and when things go wrong, and leave that to the compiler or the static analyzer to deal with for you. These can sit on method arguments, return values, or properties, anywhere you can have a type. The particularly interesting thing here is this false type. This is the only case where we have an actual value as a type, unless you count null, which is sort of a value type. This is because a lot of PHP's internal APIs, all of the built-in functions, tend to have some type on success or false on error. And that's historical reasons going back to PHP 3. So we've decided to make that a explicitly typable value just for that failure case. You cannot put true in there, for example, because PHP 3. Match expressions are a little bit harder to describe because they are a completely new type of construct, but they are effectively switch expressions, or switch statements rather. In a switch statement, you can put in a value and then say case this, case that, case the other thing, do these different statements. What's different about a match expression, first off, is that it is an expression and it actually has a return value. With switch, you only have statements to execute. With match, you actually return something to the caller. And what you return is whatever's on the right-hand side of that arrow. And what you're matching is on the left-hand side of the arrow. The second thing, which I love far more, is that it is always strict comparisons. So you don't have to worry about PHP loose type juggling, putting you in a condition where you match something you didn't actually mean to match because a string that happens containing the number 0 counts as false. Third is that it will throw an unhandled match error if you don't have a case which actually matches the value that came in, whereas switch will just fall out. So these three things together allow you to write much more explicit code that doesn't have these weird pitfalls to fall through. Constructor property promotion is just a way of writing less code, frankly. I actually think it writes more difficult to read code personally, but if you're writing a very small class with just a few number of properties that you want to be able to initialize, I can see where being able to be more succinct about it is helpful. The sharp edges you have to watch out for, though, is with the traditional class, you can just look for property definitions, which are usually clustered near the top, and you can find them very easily and they're very obvious. Now you have a second place to look. You also have to look in the arguments to the constructor, because if we have a visibility indicated in that constructor, as we do here with the word public in the construct argument list, that is defining a property. So personally, given these two different ways of defining foo that are equivalent to each other, I personally would much rather go for the top, but the second one is there if you like it. The null safe operator, or as I like to call it, the this is not Golang operator. The problem we're trying to solve here is that for a happy path, you can typically write a lot of sets of instructions as a single fluent interface. I have a thing, I'm going to ask it for another thing, I'm going to use the thing I got from that to do another thing. Or in this case, I have a router, I'm going to ask it for a specific route, and then I'm going to use that route to create a new instance of that route to actually start a request. That's the happy path. That's what you want to read to understand what the intent of the code is. Unfortunately, you always have to handle the unhappy path. And if your library was written to use exceptions, that's already easy. You just catch the exception later on and you deal with the unhappy path that way. You still have to put the try and catch out there, so it's not perfect. If your code was not written that way, maybe it's from a more functional paradigm and it returns null on error, well, now you have to say, okay, is my router null? If not, go ahead. If when I ask for a route, if the result of that is null, stop, otherwise go ahead. And you wind up with, in this case, what have we got here? 7, 8 lines of code. We can flatten that down to a single line to just say router, get route, get instance. And if anything comes up null along that point, it's just null and you're done. Much easier read for the happy path. Last is something I thought we should have had back in PHP 5.0, and it amazes me it took us this long, and that's the stringable interface. We've had this magic method that you can put on any class called toString. And if you try to cast that object of that class type to a string, it'll go to that method to actually return some value as a string. Unfortunately, there's been no easy way to tell if an object can be cast to a string or not without going into reflection, seeing if a method exists. It doesn't 100% translate to internal classes that maybe have different ways of being stringable. It's just a very inconsistent, ugly mess. So what we decided in 8.0 is that every single class that has a means to be cast to a string, whether that's a toString magic method or some internal mechanism, they are all going to magically implement the stringable interface. You don't even have to put implement stringable on there. But you can backfill this by just having something in your autoload path that creates a stringable interface, and then anyone can implement that interface and have a toString method, and you can have something that works on all versions of PHP. So that's my favorite 8. That's all I wanted to cover in the 10 minutes that Vic told me I could have, or that Bob told me I could have, one of them. Hopefully I didn't use more than 10. It looks like I probably did. But again, I'm going to say, please test these things out. Help report bugs. That is really the only way that we can effectively make sure all of this works the right way. And PHP is your language, so ask me anything you'd like, either about how the sausage is made or what's coming up next or whatever is on your mind.
That's awesome. Thanks a lot, Sarah.
And I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see you all. There we go.
I've started playing with PHP 8 using the official Docker image, which has the release candidate on it. So that's the easiest way for me to get in there and start playing with it easily. Are there any other tips you have for people to easily get on board?
Fantastic question. And I'm glad you mentioned the Docker images. Those do exist. They're semi-official. The project officially doesn't support them, but it is somebody deeply involved in the project who is doing them. So if you want to call them official, we can call them official. There are Windows builds at windows.php.net, and those are produced constantly. Microsoft has stated that they are not going to officially provide those builds anymore for the 8.0 series onward. However, one of the employees at Microsoft, who has also been a strong player in the PHP project, Christoph Becker, he was also the release manager for 7.4, by the way, has volunteered to continue producing those in his own time. And we possibly have volunteers who are going to take that on more permanently. It's not clear. That is sort of still shaping out. But honestly, if you're running Linux, and I assume probably a majority of you are, because we're programmers, PHP is honestly not that hard to build. You need a few basic tools, basically the auto tools packages like libtool, automake, autoconf, make, GCC. You have those basic set of tools. You can build PHP on your own, and you can be just up to the minute on head and checking all these things. You can run make test on that, of course, if you built it. We've got somewhere on the order of about 15,000 tests, depending on which extensions you have loaded. Then maybe that might be as high as 20. it will actually email a full report of what did and did not pass, as long as you opt into that, to us after the test is completed. So that can be as simple as typing make test, coming back in some period of time and saying, yeah, go ahead and email that. Not even hard.
Cool. I wanted to talk a little bit about people getting involved in PHP and in helping, you who are helping us. And that was one of the things you pushed at Sunshine a little bit. You were good at, trying to encourage people. And a group of us got together there, and we were all super excited about immutables and having language level support for immutable classes.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I was keen because I'd written an extension for PHP 5 a lot earlier. So I was like, oh yeah, I want to get back in there and play with that. And we're going to make this thing happen. And we started compiling a list of all of the previous RFCs that had failed for that and trying to figure out why and seeing how we'd move forward. And I subscribed to internals and I'm following it. And I see at that time, there were 2 separate people trying to get something going for immutables. And it all got shot down. And basically, I lost heart. The whole thing fizzled. And obviously, you're super encouraging. And I get the idea of having these strict gatekeepers protecting the language we're using and that we love. But I'm wondering what your take is on how to balance that wish to become involved and do something, cool and guarding the language and how that works as far as the governance and getting things through.
Well, the first thing I want to say there is I will object to the use of the term gatekeeper. There are definitely people who have a little bit more authority on the project than just random Joe coming in because they have been on the project for longer and they've been doing more work on it for longer. But the important thing to know is that PHP, like nobody really owns PHP. And that's actually kind of weird because most languages you at least have a BDFL who ostensibly owns the language. And we kind of do in the form of Rasmus and to a lesser extent Seven Andy. But Rasmus, as sort of the top of that chain, very strongly explicitly says, like, I don't own PHP. PHP is the project, is the product of the people who have been working on it for the past 25 years. And I don't want to have more of a say in it than anyone else who's just happened to have been helping me out with it. And he'll also say, like, I'm not particularly active lately anyway. And I think largely Zev and Andy are following that line. I don't know if they necessarily feel the same way, but they at least follow that from a project governance standpoint. And it holds true. So my other release manager, Gabriel Caruso, you mentioned you listened to the interview with Cal. I actually found out myself in that interview, he'd actually only started using PHP, what, 2 years ago, did he say? Something like that? Like, wow. He has not even been using PHP for very long. But he made the decision that he wanted to get involved and he wanted to do open source work. And that is the first and main thing that anyone has to do, is just make that decision that they want to get involved. And getting involved can be at any level. You talked about writing extensions, which requires a certain hill to get over of knowledge of C internals and the way linkages work and pointers and things like that. But you don't even need to start there. You start with documentation. PHP has a whole bunch of different translations into other languages. And if the only thing that you want to contribute is that you know English and one other language, maintain that language, you are doing PHP a massive service already. If you only know English and you just want to make the base translation of the manual better, you're doing a massive service. When I came into the language some years ago, my favorite thing about PHP was that it had such an amazing manual. I had no trouble finding anything about how to do stuff. There were examples everywhere. There were user-contributed notes that were well curated. There was a solid search feature. Like, it made it so easy to get into the language that I stuck with it. And so I cannot stress the importance of documentation enough. Beyond that, tests. This is an entire Google Hangout full of people who, at least I hope, all know how to write some PHP. All of our tests in PHP, they're all written in PHP. So if you can write PHP, you can write a PHP test. Look in the source tree for any file with a .phpt extension, and that is a PHP test. And it's got a little bit of formatting in it to say, here's the name, here's reasons you should skip this test, here's the code you should run, and here's what you should expect, or a pattern of what you should expect. Write more tests. Make sure that we're working in all situations. Run the test. There are tons of ways to contribute without ever having to even get down to C. But hey, if you want to get better at C, and my C was awful when I started the project, like I spent one semester in college, and during that semester, I took a C course. That was the extent of my knowledge of C when I actually started working on this project. And I got into it by finding a thing I wanted to make better in the source and just making that one little thing better. I didn't have to worry about how to make projects build or how to handle main functions or how to talk through sockets. I just made that one function better. Look in the log function. It has a second parameter because I wanted to get involved in PHP. And that was, I think, about 3 lines of C code. It wasn't even hard. It even looked like PHP code. So there are definitely steps you can take in getting into that kind of work. And you kind of use it as a gateway drug to get into more complicated things. And I learned everything I know about parsers from looking at the PHP parser. And that has weirdly been partially responsible for getting me the current job I have, because the guy who interviewed me was big on language parsers and wanted me to write one from scratch. So there I was. Like, I happen to know that. OSS pays back. Like it will almost always pay back what you put into it. And very often it will pay back more than you put into it. So just decide you want to do something. Don't worry about the idea of gatekeepers, because if you care about a thing and you put your effort into it, it's going to get, well, I'll say in this project, at least, it'll get recognized. Definitely there are projects that have very iron fist on them, but this is not one of them.
Yeah, I meant gatekeepers, like, I guess the voting process, right? I mean, even like my example of the immutable support, there were at least a couple that actually had implementations where people had built it and the votes just didn't go there. And I, looking at so many of them, I thought, I don't know that there's a way of doing this that's going to get enough people together that are going to pass any version of this. But
as far as that goes, I mean, you use that example, but like, let's look at named parameters. Named parameters was on a lot of wish lists for a very long time. And the answer was always, well, it's going to slow down the runtime too much to do that. Or, hey, this isn't Python, go use Python if that's what you want. Or, any number of excuses why not. But it eventually got there. I think generics are going to eventually get there because there's enough of a continuous ask for it. I think that immutable properties and individual property getter setter methods will eventually get there, or something like that.
Yeah.
It's going to take a combination of community demand and, I hate to say this, just the ephemeral winds of people's moods at the time. Having the right people actively voting makes a difference. But the important thing about the RFC and the voting process, which we didn't always have, by the way, it's relatively new. It's like maybe 10 years old tops, maybe 8, 7, I don't know. It's relatively new, is that it keeps us from doing really dumb things. Earlier in PHP's process, if you had an itch, you scratched it, and even if it was a poorly thought through idea, that's what was in, because somebody wrote it and they committed it and nobody had a good enough reason to reverse it. That's the downside of not having a strong BDFL. You don't have anybody steering the ship. RFCs and the voting process allow us to have steering by consensus. And yeah, the downside of that is sometimes perfectly good ideas with perfectly good implementations require patience. So have patience.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I do appreciate that aspect of it, that you're protecting, and how much better it is now. I mean, all of those lists of why PHP is an awful language seem to stem from those earlier, less fortunate decisions. So definitely.
Fractal of bad design. Yeah. We've all read that article. Yeah.
There was one interesting question that came in before this, asking about whether there was any formal relationship between the Composer project and PHP itself. And I mean, I think the answer is no. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? It's just a project that uses PHP. But what I thought was really interesting about it was a a long time ago, I was chatting with Zev Sarasky about some of the optimizations Zend was making for PHP 5. And he talked about the fact that they used Magento as the e-commerce for Zend.
Okay.
And so a lot of the optimization that went into PHP 5 was specifically around Magento use cases.
I would qualify that and say a lot of the optimizations that Zev and Dimitri put in to PHP 5 were around his use cases. And again, that's down to that scratching of the itch thing. But oh gosh, what was it? I lost the thread of what I was going to reply to that though. It left entirely.
Well, it might be, because I was going to say it might have been you at Sunshine again that mentioned there was one feature they really wanted to see added to the core in PHP to do with some of the, and I can't remember specifically what it was now, but basically the thing that is the worst about making Composer slow, and how if it could be done in C, it would make such a huge difference to the performance. And that's why this question really twigs that with me. And I thought, that makes a lot of sense that that kind of relationship would happen.
So I don't know if that was my thing, because I do have a laundry list of things that I would love to see added to PHP, because I think they would make the ergonomics of the language a lot better. I don't know that many of them are to do with Composer, but that does remind me, yes, I was going to say Composer. Formally, no. PHP actually has informally a policy against endorsing any framework, any library, and that includes Composer just as a project. We try to remain as neutral as we can. That said, Composer and many of these other projects all in some form or another have some representative on internals, because they care about the outcome and they care about making sure that PHP is servicing their needs properly. And they're contributing code as well. So there is definitely informal relationships there, and there are definitely close ties. Certainly when I talk about some new feature coming in, like, okay, some of the smaller features for PHP 8.0, stir begins with and stir ends with, or stir starts with, or whatever it was called, stir contains. I voted against all of these functions because I would rather see them brought in through a Composer dependency or some external dependency. I always refer to Composer because Composer seems to be everywhere. Everybody loves Composer. I love Composer. I think it works freaking great. So I tend to say, no, build a packagist. You build a package, put it on packagist, and let people install it through Composer. That way, A, they get it quicker. It's available on all versions that you can make it compatible with, and you can fix the bug fixes much more quickly and much better. And the code that's written for it can be seen by the JIT. One of the things that slows down the JIT for a language like PHP is that it can only see script code. It can't see any of those internals implementations that are written in C. All it can do is say, there's my function pointer, go call it, and our value is going to come back. If you can see the insides of these functions, you can inline them, you can tail recurse them, you can do extra optimizations that just aren't possible when you cross the PHP-C boundary. So to me, I see several dozen reasons why it should not be included in the core as a C implementation, but the feature passes, so I'm not going to lose a lot of sleep over it.
So it's interesting. Did I miss something about there being function auto loading, or would you have to put those in a class?
That's fair. There is not function auto loading yet, and I don't know why there is not function auto loading yet. There's not a good, strong technical reason for it. I think the biggest complaint that people have against enabling function autoloading is global scope resolution. So right now, I can write $x equals stir to upper $x, and that'll just work. I don't have to qualify that with a backslash. And I can do that even if I'm inside of a namespace, because we have this global fallback this is fallback to the global namespace. We don't have that for classes because we decided we didn't want that for classes when we did namespaces. And so we have this unequal footing when it comes to saying we can auto load functions, because we don't know exactly how to resolve that when it comes to the autoloader. I do think that's a dumb excuse, and I would like to just pull that Band-Aid off in a major. 8.0 would have been a great time to do it, but we're not going to, so we probably won't be able to pull that off until 9.0 at the best.
You heard it here first, folks. 9.0, big new feature, function auto loading.
You know what? You know what? You laugh at that, but at SymphonyCon Cluj a couple of years ago, somebody asked when I thought 8.0 was going to come out, and I was like this close with my random guess. Like I was so close. So maybe watch for
Yeah.
it. Well, you know, if you folks get involved and you champion for it on the list and maybe offer some patches, who knows? Yeah, no, we don't have function autoloading. However, Composer packages will let you load a file on the startup of a request, so you can bring functions in a single load file. So it's not as good, but it gets the job done.
Right.
Especially when we start looking at the preload file, which 7.4 introduced. I'm sure if it hasn't already, I'm sure Composer is looking at ways of getting stuff into preload that is coming in through those particular autoloaders.
Makes sense. Now, on the subject of extending PHP and all that kind of stuff, the other talk other than PHP that you gave at Sunshine was about FFI. And we had somebody asking about the SPL and what sort of languages were used to build PHP and how, you know, how the SPL is built, basically. And it did make me think of your talk, and I thought maybe you could elaborate a little bit on those things.
So SPL is not particularly unique from any other extension in PHP. I mean, it's written in C, and these things are exposed as PHP classes and the APIs that go with them. So if you've written any other class in a PHP extension, you've done the same thing that SPL does. It happens to do with a lot of macros because it has a lot of very common definitions, so it tries to save some room on the code, but it's the same thing at the end of the day. PHP can be written in other languages, C++. I even played briefly with allowing JavaScript to call into PHP. I know we have a bunch of extensions that go the other way, but I decided to embed PHP into JavaScript once, just for funs. Java bridges exist, and you can write Java that will be run as PHP. I've forgotten the question already.
Oh, no, that's okay. Sorry. It was also about FFI as a way to make make it easier to write extensions.
So I have mixed feelings on FFI. On the one hand, yes, it definitely does make prototyping very small amounts of stuff quite easy.
Before getting into the weeds, we probably have at least half the people here going, FF what?
Yes. Foreign function include. The idea of FFI is it allows you to take any random library out there with C linkage, basically any .so file, and load it up dynamically into the runtime and call regular C functions in there. And it does a lot of that mapping of PHP types into the internal types for you. I say a lot because I have to qualify that very strongly. The library that we use to actually make all that magic happens is frankly not very good. It cannot run preprocessor defines inside of a header file, which means that any header file for a library that is more than just a tiny bit complicated is going to barf, and it's just not going to work. So what you end up having to do is look for the definitions you want, copy them out, possibly change them slightly because they use macros somewhere that you have to sort of expand on your own behalf, and it's very, very difficult. Anthony Ferrara built a program library called FFIME, which will take these more complex header files and do its best job of translating them for you into simple header files. Its best job is not perfect, but it's actually pretty good. So now you have this additional piece of user space functionality to get this bit of magic internals functionality to work to maybe call these library functions. When I say I don't like that, that is largely coming from a privileged position of knowing exactly how the PHP extension API works because I've written large parts of it. I understand that not everybody has that encyclopedic knowledge, but it does seem to me like if you have that need to call into some external library that has no PHP bindings yet, it is probably more time effective to learn how to make those bindings by hand than it is to try to make FFI fit your square peg into a round hole. It's going to be hard no matter how you do it, unfortunately.
All right. Thank you.
I have a quick question. On the topic of contributing to PHP, it's kind of a question that I've been bouncing around for a couple years now, but every year I donate financially to the top open source projects that I get a lot of use out of. And for years, I have wanted to make a financial donation to the PHP project, to the top developers working on it in their spare time or something. But anytime I ask around, I hit like a brick wall. No one has an answer for me.
So I have an answer, but you won't like it. My answer that you're not going to like is that this is one of the very few questions where we do actually have to go to Rasmus for, because there are tax implications involved, and there are representational issues, I guess would be the right way to put that. And basically his answer is, what would we do with it? PHP lives on donated servers, on donated bandwidth, and has done so for 20 plus years quite successfully. If we had money in our pocket, nobody really knows what we would do with that money. And until, as a group, we can decide what we would do with money like that, it's very, very difficult to say, oh, sure, send it, and it's going to go in this bank account here somewhere that somebody's paying taxes on, because we don't have a 501c3 yet, although Ben Ramsey's offered to make that. And we'll figure it out.
Honestly, I kind of just want to donate directly to the developers who are working on it in their free time. It doesn't have to be officially to the PHP project, but just so much of this is coming in people's free time that it blows my mind. I was like, I feel like
you are 100% welcome to do that. It's especially good that now GitHub has this GitHub sponsors thing. So like you can go to the PHP project, go to the Insights tab, see who's committing the most, decide however many you want to do, however you want to split your pot, and just see if they've got sponsor buttons. And if they don't, maybe message them and say, hey, do you want to set your sponsor button so I can put some towards you? I have my sponsor set up. I certainly wouldn't say no. But I also, I think you should make your own decision on how you're going to spend that. I don't really need the money, honestly, but I won't say no.
That's a great suggestion. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
One of the questions that came in before we started tonight was about async in PHP. And the first time I saw async was in Hackling. And I tried to figure it out. I could not make it do anything. And since then, I've found that async in JavaScript or TypeScript, very intuitive. It's built into the language, basically. PHP, I keep seeing things about async, but it never really seems to deliver on the promise. And I wondered if you had any insights around whether async in PHP was real or whether it was some kind of fantasy.
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is Hackling's async is built on the same basic model as JavaScript is. So now that you understand JavaScript, you should, in theory, be able to do Hackling just fine. But that requires some very specific support in the HHVM runtime. And for complicated reasons to do with threading concurrency and the way PHP was born as a Apache module, that's actually kind of hard to shoehorn into PHP right now. Potentially, we could see it at some point someday with that threading support built in. But I think right now there's the technical hurdle of getting over those threading issues. And there's also a conceptual hurdle of deciding, well, what model do we actually want to use? Personally, I think it makes a lot of sense to follow the same model as JavaScript, because a lot of PHP developers write a lot of JavaScript code. And it makes sense for those idioms to be the same. Other languages have completely different designs. I know Joe Watkins, release manager for 7.1, he'll tell you that adding native threading into the language is the way to do this, and having script writers deal with concurrency directly. Certainly native threads, or his extension pthreads, will give you a lot more power. You could do far more things with pthreads than you can do with async and await, which are actually just single threads disguised as multiple threads. But they are also even harder to get right, as any Java developer will tell you when they've tried to write a concurrent function. They run into lots of problems. I think Golang has actually done that model much better, honestly. But I don't think we would adopt Golang's concurrency model either, because there are some difficult to grasp concepts in that, and when you're fighting between that model and JavaScript's, you're just creating a lot more work for the user. So I want us to get to a JavaScript style async await, but I wouldn't expect it before 9. I don't think anyone's got the energy to put into that aspect of it right now.
Oh, I thought, sorry, my mute wasn't where I thought it was. I have dark memories of doing POSIX threads in C++ and all the horror show around that. So I agree with you 100% about async JavaScript style being a much more developer-friendly approach. But yeah, it'd be nice to see that kind of thing come down the pipeline. I've one more out of the list that was from before, and then I know Bob's already queued up a few that have come in during, and that was about serverless. So I don't know how much you track serverless, things like AWS Lambda, and we've got PHP layers we can use there now. So now we can use PHP or write PHP for serverless. And it's always struck me as a really odd thing, because in the like early days of PHP, we had shared hosting environments. So it was like a multi-tenant situation, and it was like it was almost serverless before serverless. You know what I mean? And and now with current serverless, it's like square peg round hole. It works, but it's not easy. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it does require you to think of your application in a different way, and almost to write it in a different way because of the elastic nature of it. The first thing I would say about serverless is that I think PHP is honestly adapted to serverless much better because it was built on shared nothing from day one. You don't have to have an application server that has state in it constantly. PHP, every request starts life with a completely blank slate and ends it with a blank slate. So I think PHP is meant for the serverless world. I think because of Amazon's priorities, they didn't necessarily make it the first implementation of their serverless design, but they kind of couldn't help but include it. As for like, I guess where I see that going, I mean, there's different ways that this can play out. Obviously, I hate the term serverless, by the way, because it's so meaningless. Obviously, you're on a server. The sort of Amazon-y serverless model, I don't want to call it a fad, but I think that so what it is, the Amazon-y sort of serverless model is really good at helping the smaller sites scale as they're getting up to speed and can't really afford proper iron to run their systems on, whether it's virtual iron or real iron. I think any site is going to find itself in a position where that no longer works for them, and what they actually just start building is sort of first-class API tiers that are just regular servers that are serving up whatever part of their architecture they need to do. So I mean, it has a point, but it's not a part of the architecture I find myself working with much, I guess. And I don't know if that went to the question or not. Sometimes I mean,
it was really just getting an idea what your thoughts are on it, and I appreciate that, and I share those opinions.
And for the record, I could be 100% wrong. It is worth noting that I don't write a lot of applications these days. The last time I wrote an application, it was Yahoo Search. So it's been a while.
Yeah, I've got I've done a few Lambdas on AWS, all with Node, and the most heavy of them, it costs enough that it probably makes sense to rewrite it without the Lambda because our bills are huge on it.
I didn't think of the cost aspect of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, it just can't make sense anymore.
No, you're right. It absolutely didn't in that case. But well, I don't want to get too much into it. For it was like a complete unknown of how much we'd have to scale it. So it made sense to start there to figure out what we were dealing with. But the bills are